Last time on Deconverted Man.
Blah blah, something about fallacies, blah 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 blah. And I cut my video short because screw it, I'm done, blah.
And now, the continuation of Deconverted Man versus Dry Apologist.
Wait, is that what we're doing now? Is that even a thing? I guess that's what we're doing now. Okay.
Hi there, thanks for watching. So this is a response video to Deconverted Man's response video to my video on the sustaining cause proof for God. And that's the first response video somebody's made to one of my videos. So that's cool. So we've been going back and forth a little bit, and I was on his show a couple of weeks ago. So basically, it seems like his main objection to the argument is that what I call the consistent causal framework, or also could be called the law of causality or principle of causality or principle of sufficient reason. I like calling it the consistent causal framework. I think that captures the essence of it better. So basically, he's arguing that at the quantum level and in the prior conditions, so the early conditions of the Big Bang, that the consistent causal framework may not apply. And I acknowledge in my video that at the quantum level, I don't talk about the Big Bang because that's not really what the argument's about, but at the quantum level, things do appear to behave probabilistically, or also sometimes called indeterministically. Yet that doesn't prove that things actually lack a cause. It would at most prove that things don't have a determination of their outcome. That could be due to their nature. That could be due to their probabilistic nature. And other philosophers like Ed Theseus, for example, have acknowledged this.
But why should we care what philosophers have to say on this matter? Aren't we investigating reality itself? And doesn't that require us to use the scientific method? That's the method that has been proven to work, after all. If not that, then at least the logical method, which I don't think would include necessarily using philosophers to say, well, yeah, they've commented on this and they agree with this, that, or the other. Who cares? They're not scientists. What do they know? So I think that appealing to philosophers would just be an appeal to the wrong authority.
Things behaving in an indeterministic or probabilistic way at the quantum level doesn't actually prove that things lack a cause. And the same thing would go for the initial conditions of the Big Bang. So that's one point. And I actually raised that point in the very video. He didn't address that part, but it was later on in the argument. So I don't think that things being weird or probabilistic at the quantum level actually indicates that things lack a cause.
Correct. These things don't show that cause and effect don't happen, but these two things are potential examples where we don't know what could be going on, and it might be the case that cause and effect doesn't happen in these things, or it might be that cause and effect does apply. We don't know. So how can we make a universal statement when we have not just one, but two potential counterexamples to our otherwise perfectly fine universal statement? All men are mortal is a very safe universal statement to make because we understand biology and we understand physics and we understand that men are in fact mortal. We don't have any example of a man ever not being mortal. But if we did, we'd have to change the statement to reflect that. If we had even one example, or there's a potential for an example, someone that is a theist could in fact introduce such an example. They could say, well, Jesus was partly man and yet wasn't really mortal in the end, so therefore not all men are mortal if they're Jesus. Okay, well then we have to change the universal to reflect that. Of course, that's granting that Jesus is somebody that can be immortal in a sense. If there isn't any reason to grant that at all, then we're safe with the universal as is. Similarly, we're safe with the universal of cause and effect when we didn't know any better. But once we did, then we're not. Or were we always not safe with this particular universal because we simply haven't explored all of the universe? It should give us pause for thought. And if it doesn't, and that's not reflected in the argument, then something might be going wrong with the argument, and that's going to incur logical fallacies at some level.
But he also seemed to suggest that at the quantum level, that classical logic doesn't apply.
This goes into, to some degree, my view of how logic, at its core, functions. I view logic as a human endeavor, something we made, we created, we've refined over time, and that it maps to reality as best as we're able to understand reality. As we understand reality better and better, we're going to update logic to better fit reality. But I don't think that we've done that for quantum physics and or for extreme states that the universe can be in, like super heat or very super cold. I don't know that we've tried even to get logic to explain those things or to map to those things. And it might be that we don't really need to, because those things are outside of the scope of classical logic, outside of the scope even maybe of non-classical logic, and primarily in the scope of hard science, because they are hard science, and it just simply is something that logic is unable to perform that particular task. Or it might be that logic is suitable to explain these sort of things and reduce them down to formulas that we can use that are then reducible to syllogisms at some level. But I don't know if that's been done for quantum physics and or superheat / super cold. So if we don't have that, and I have not found anything for that, and my opponent offers us nothing for it, then all we have is just what we are used to, the classical logic. There we have the, typical laws of logic, and one of them has been challenged many times, the law of identity. In classical logic, it's just taken and asserted as being true, and that's that. And it's very useful. Apple is always an apple. It's never not an apple. Okay, that's pretty good. It works for most things. But, of course, there has been challenges. For example, the ship of Theseus, I think that's how you say his name. But here's this question of identity. You have a ship launch, and as the ship goes on, pieces fall off, but then they replace the pieces with new pieces, and so it finally comes into the next port, and it has essentially been rebuilt along the way. Is it the same ship that left? And then, the pieces that were thrown away, just to make things more complicated, somebody goes and gets those pieces and rebuilds the ship. And now you have two ships of Theseus, or just one, or is it still the same? And then if you really think about it, if I say, well, I'm always me, but I'm not the me that I was 10 years ago, so how am I still me? I mean, all the cells that I have are, changing around. So what does it mean to have this identity thing? And because there's some possible ways to make this ambiguous, students of logic have looked at it and said, well, we need to go away from classical logic and have a different framework. We still need logic, just have to do it in some different way. And there's been many proposals for how to go about and do that. Now, that might one day combined with classical logic into a finalized version of logic, or it might be that these debates never get settled. I have no idea. It is somewhat beyond the scope of an analysis of one single video to go into the metaphysics of logic itself, but it is something that I think is worth talking about, both because here we have an example of a part of reality that I don't know has ever been mapped with logic. Mathematics certainly has mapped quantum physics to some degree, but to then turn that into some sort of formulas within language and to be able to turn that into sentences that are informal or even formal for that matter, I don't know that that's been done. If it has, great. Then that could be part of the argumentation. Not just mentioning that, well, yeah, quantum physics is a thing, but it doesn't really negate what I'm saying, maybe. But to really add it into the argumentation in full, using the logical formulas that you can show have been, in fact, applied to quantum physics and mapped to that reality as well. This is why I suggested a truth table, I think, last time. It would help us to see that mapping going on. But I don't think that there is that. I don't think it's been done, and I think it's beyond the ability of my opponent to do it. I know that it's beyond my ability to do it. So, well, we'll see if maybe it is out there and simply I don't know where to look for it, and my opponent does. Great. It's still his burden to present that. Until then, I think we still have potential counterexamples, and because of that, we still have a potential that cause and effect might not always be true, and because of that, it's no longer a universal statement, and so that hinders the argument.
So he seemed to suggest that classical logic doesn't apply, and I've heard that before. However, it depends upon what somebody means by that. There are certain laws of classical logic, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but certain laws of classical logic may not strictly apply in certain situations. But that doesn't mean that the law of logic doesn't apply at all. And I don't think he made the case, or at least he didn't explain why it wouldn't apply at all. There are some weird oddities. I think he showed an image of Schrodinger's cat. Yeah, that sometimes gets suggested that the law of identity or law of non-contradiction or both, or excluded middle, all these classical foundational laws don't apply because the cat can be alive and dead at the same time. I don't know all the details about that, but to me, that would at most show there's an interpretation that we need to reinterpret how these laws would apply. I don't think that proves that something can't exist and not exist at the same time.
Correct. Again, these things are not meant to be an example of why we should think that this thing is not true. Because I'm not saying that any particular law of logic is thrown out the window because of quantum physics, or that in the extreme heat of the universe that therefore this or that law of logic doesn't apply, or in the extreme cold of the universe that this and that wouldn't apply. I don't have any idea what would or wouldn't apply in these realms, because I don't understand these realms well enough, and I am not aware of anyone that has attempted to map logic to these realms. And as I said earlier, I think that logic maps to reality, because if it doesn't, what use is it? So here we have 2 or 3 aspects of reality that logic, as far as I understand it, hasn't really been mapped to. So there are areas where I have unknowns. Now, I mentioned earlier that if Jesus was known to be a thing, that we would then have a counterexample to the classical statement, all men are mortal. This is a universal statement that has been made many times. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Well, but you can't make that statement if Jesus actually was a man, because in the end he wasn't really mortal, or at least not exactly mortal. And so it muddies the waters to some degree, and so we might have to alter the statement to reflect that, because our understanding of reality would now encompass this new thing. In fact, if we knew that God really existed for sure, that would certainly alter our idea of reality, and we'd have to map logic to fit God in that. Now, of course, many Christians have said that logic is stable because of God or something like this, but then you're like, but then the miracle things kind of screw that up, don't they? How does that work? You know, it's okay for God to adjust logic to negate it in Jesus's case, and then it doesn't affect the rest of logic. Like, how does this work? And how is that not special pleading? And I've heard attempts to try to resolve all of those problems, and I would love to know if Dry has a solution to any of those things, although it does kind of veer off from the topic at hand, which is whether or not cause and effect is universal in the first place. And that's all I'm asking is, can we truly say it is universal when we have one, maybe two, maybe three potential counterexamples? Quantum physics is one. Heat, extreme heat, that's another. Extreme cold, that's another. And then maybe black holes would be another. You know, so how many more potential counterexamples might there be that we haven't considered when thinking about cause and effect? And if we just say, well, those don't really matter, that's, you know, if you had an argument that really did that, that would be great. But I've read your argument, it doesn't do that, so it needs to be changed. It needs to be redone. First of all, the formatting of it is not an argument in that format, so it needs to be redone for that alone. Then it needs to be redone to address the issues in a coherent scientific manner, which would be more acceptable than mussing on philosophical possibilities. Because you're going to have to resolve the question of, does the universe have a sustaining cause or need one at all? And find that out via science, not just a philosophical argument. Especially because the philosophical argument is asking the question which presumes that there is one in the first place. The argument as is, if causal relations are consistent due to chance, cause, nature of things, or due to a necessarily consistent causal framework. That assumes a whole lot in that particular sentence. It is an if statement, making this a potential hypothetical syllogism, but there's so many statements made that I'm not sure what your argument actually is. And that's why it needs to be redone so that it's in syllogistic format. What is the essence of this argument? Things need a cause. There needs to be a sustaining thing of the cause, and that thing has to be God. Something like that. The closest you come to that is where you say, if there's a necessary, consistent causal framework, then contingent things must have a cause in order to exist. There is a necessarily consistent causal framework, therefore contingent things must have a cause in order to exist. But you'd have to support that with science, not just with logic. You have to show that it's the case universally. And in many cases, you haven't done that yet. Just saying, well, but they probably don't matter. Or, well, you know, it's not really a problem. But how do you know that? You'd have to have an additional argument. And ultimately, you'd have to have a scientific thing that says, no, this doesn't hurt this at all. Trying to figure out if the universe even needs something to keep it together, isn't that a scientific question, not a philosophical one?
To me, that's just the most obvious truth that there is. So that's where my foundational epistemology stems from, would be a truth claim like that, that X can't exist and not exist at the same time. And if somebody says, well, maybe that's not a truth, I would ask for what reason they have, and any reason they're going to give is going to be less obvious than that truth itself.
The argument you are employing, nurse, is not logical. In fact, it is an argument from incredulity, or an appeal to common sense. A logical fallacy.
I thought she was making pretty good sense.
That may seem so, yeoman, but her argument is invalid. An appeal to common sense asserts that because something is so incredible or difficult to imagine, it must be wrong. Arguments from incredulity happen when people make their inability to comprehend or make sense of a concept their argument.
And any reason they're going to give is going to be less obvious than that truth itself.
By saying that any reason that they give will be ultimately less plausible than the truth itself, you've in fact committed this particular fallacy among others I could mention.
Even if an argument seems to make sense, it cannot be valid unless the form is valid, and that it does not exhibit one of the logical fallacies such as the argument from incredulity or the appeal to common sense. It's only logical.
But then he also raises this point that I'm like begging the question because I'm looking for a sustaining cause. But that's not the case at all. I'm arguing that there needs to be a necessary being. That could be the universe, at least at the initial outset of the argument, could be a necessary being that sustains the universe. I leave that open.
Neither your video nor your written argument asks the open question, is there a sustaining force of the universe, or does it need one? In fact, no question is ever posed by your video or your written version of the argument. The argument's entire purpose is about what sustains the universe. It assumes there is a thing that sustains the universe in the first place. Therefore, it is closed.
Next time on Deconverted Man!
I can't take this anymore! Ah!
That's next time on Deconverted Man! Make sure to sub, hit the bell, like, tweet, and do all the things that you need to do to make sure that you don't miss it. Also analyze Deconverted Man's last argument. That would be good. A lot of people have seen it by now, right? Nobody saw it by now? Nobody wants to analyze it?